We've met a lot of criminals in the course of a brief history, from the manipulative and cunning Charles Manson to the desperate and unhinged Aileen Wournos. But despite the myriad of ages, genders, and looks, many people tend to focus in on what they expect a serial killer to look like. The subject of our story today defies all stereotypes about what a serial killer would look like, and shows us that even the kindest and sweetest looking people can turn out to be monsters. Today, we're building the home of a woman known as the Landlady of Death. This is a brief history of Dorothea Puente. As always, this episode of A Brief History contains graphic content and may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. Born Dorothea Gray on January 9, 1929 to Trudy and Jesse James Gray in Redlands, California, Dorothea didn't have a picture-perfect upbringing. Both of her parents had severe drinking problems, and her father's mental health was tumultuous at best. It is said that Jesse would frequently threaten to commit suicide in front of Dorothea and her siblings. In 1937, Jesse James Gray died of tuberculosis, and Trudy lost all custody of the children in the following year, just before perishing in a motorcycle accident. Dorothea and her siblings were sent to an orphanage, where she was sexually abused until the siblings were picked up by family and ultimately taken to Fresno, California. Dorothea was married for the first of 4 times in 1946. Unfortunately, her husband died a mere 2 years later of a heart attack. Desperate for money after the untimely death of her husband, Dorothea turned to forging checks to keep herself afloat. She was eventually caught and sentenced to a year in jail, but was paroled after only 6 months. After being released from prison, Dorothea had a quick tryst with an unknown man and eventually gave birth to a child which she immediately placed for adoption. Dorothea married her second husband, Axel Johansson, in 1952. Their marriage was abusive and violent by all accounts, and her crimes started piling up during their 14-year marriage. In 1960, Dorothea was arrested for running a brothel, and was arrested again soon after for vagrancy. Eventually, she found work as a nurse's aide and began to manage boarding houses, despite her troubled past. In 1966, Dorothea and Axel divorced, and she quickly moved on to a man nearly 2 decades younger than her, Roberto Puente. It would be the Puente name that Dorothea ended up living under during the remainder of her life. The marriage between Dorothea and Roberto was short-lived, lasting only 2 years after Roberto had a number of affairs. Just before their divorce, Dorothea purchased a house at 2100 F Street in Sacramento, California. It was a 16-room care house where Dorothea provided aid to addicts, the homeless, and generally destitute peoples of Sacramento. The boarding house and Dorothea herself were seen to be beacons of the community. Dorothea spent her time holding AA meetings, assisting people signing up for Social Security benefits, funding charities, interviewing on radio programs, and more. During this time, Dorothea married again to Pedro Montalvo, but the marriage dissipated just a week later. Despite being seen as a light in the community from the outside, on the inside, Dorothea was as ruthless and uncaring as she had been in her younger days. In 1978, she was found to be illegally cashing state and federal checks of the tenants that came in and out of her boarding house. She was not sent to prison, but instead given 5 years probation and was ordered to pay restitution. Around this time, Dorothea purchased a second property on F Street, which would eventually hold her apartment in the upstairs. In 1982, a friend and business partner named Ruth Monroe rented a space from Dorothea in the new home on F Street. Not long after, Monroe was found in the apartment, dead, of an apparent overdose of codeine and Tylenol. Dorothea presented to the police that Monroe had been depressed due to her husband's illness, and the police ruled Monroe's death a suicide. Just weeks after the death of Monroe, another boarder, 74-year-old Malcolm McKenzie, accused Dorothea of drugging him and stealing his pension check. She was arrested for the accusation and eventually sentenced to 5 years in jail in August of 1982. During her time in lockdown, Dorothea began a pen pal relationship with an elderly man named Everson Gilsmith. Dorothea served 3 years and was released in 1985, immediately opening up a joint bank account with her newfound pen pal. The relationship between the pair moved into romantic territory fairly quickly, and it is said that they were making plans to be wed. In November of 1985, Dorothea decided to do some work on her new house at F Street, and hired a handyman to install some wood paneling in the apartment. While working on the home, Dorothea also solicited him to build a 6 by 3 by 2 foot box for storage, which he agreed to. After finishing the box, Dorothea was left to fill it on her own, and eventually nailed it shut. Dorothea reapproached her handyman, asking him to transport the box to a storage depot. The pair went off with the box in the truck bed, but were stopped short when Dorothea asked him to just stop and drop the box by the river, an unofficial dumping site for household wares. 2 months later, a fisherman discovered the box by the edge of the water, and police found the badly decomposed body of an elderly man, who could not at the time be properly identified. We now know it was the body of Dorothea's paramour, Everson Gilsmith. Despite Gilsmith being dead, Dorothea continued to collect his pension and even wrote to members of his family, explaining that he just hadn't contacted them because he was ill. Dorothea continued to run the boarding house, becoming known to social workers as a person who would take even the toughest of cases. And despite her previous crimes, she still collected her tenants' mail and cashed their checks, giving them allowances and maintaining the rest of the money for her expenses. But it wouldn't be long before she made a mistake and cast suspicion on herself. A fairly well-known homeless alcoholic around the area known as Chief had been taken under Dorothea's wing, and she hired him as her own personal handyman. His activities were suspicious at best while working for her. Neighbors noticed Chief taking wheelbarrows full of dirt from the basement of the home at F Street and installing a fresh concrete slab in the basement. Chief was also seen tearing down the garage on the property and putting down a large concrete slab in the yard where the garage had once stood. Soon after, Chief disappeared. In November of 1988, the suspicion would be too far to overlook. A tenant of Dorothea's named Alvaro Montoya disappeared and was reported missing by his social worker after failing to show up for meetings. Police showed up at the F Street home to investigate the disappearance and discovered recently disturbed soil in the backyard of the home. That day, police discovered 7 bodies in the yard, at varying stages of decomposition. Dorothea wasn't even thought to be a suspect at the time, and was instead led off to a hotel by police for her to get some coffee. Upon arrival to the hotel, Dorothea waited until the police had moved their focus off of her, and she fled to Los Angeles, where she went to a bar. She began chatting up an elderly man at the bar who recognized her from the news and called the authorities. Dorothea was found and arrested, with the trial beginning in October of 1992. During the trial, it was shown that Dorothea had used sleeping pills to drug her tenants into a deep sleep before suffocating them and hiring convicts to dig the holes to bury them in the yard of her apartment. It is still unknown how the elderly Dorothea Puente transported the bodies into the graves in the yard. The jury deliberated for a full month after the trial, and eventually she was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. The jury was unable to come up with an agreement on the other 6 murders she was charged for. Dorothea was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and maintained her innocence, saying her boarders died of natural causes, until her death in March 2011 from natural causes. The house at 1426 F Street, where the bodies were discovered, is a historical home in Sacramento, and by law cannot be torn down. The current owners have embraced the house's sordid history and have turned it into a bit of attraction in Sacramento. It was also recently featured in the show Murder House Flip. Would Dorothea have been found out sooner if it wasn't for her looks and demeanor as a kind elderly woman? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Brief History. Thank you to my patrons who support this series. You are so appreciated. If you'd like to suggest future episodes of A Brief History, be sure to join the Discord linked in the description box below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime Sims content every Friday or Saturday. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.